do we read Narnia wrong? Do we misunderstand its core message? Is it, as perhaps we think, a series of children's books which have some kind of vague Christian teachings in them, some equivalents where you can say, oh, this is meant to be like this Christian belief? Or is there something else going on in the Narnia books? I think it's a really interesting question, because lots of us probably who have read Narnia, have had this mixed experience, especially as adults, where we read these books, find them compelling, perhaps find depth or emotional resonance, spiritual resonance, whatever you want to put it. But then we also say, but these are quite simple books, aren't they? And I don't get this element. Why is Father Christmas wandering around Lion Witch Wardrobe? Isn't that a bit of a gauche insertion? What on earth is the silver chair about? Why is the air full of water when they come down from Aslan's land? Lots of things like that, where you end up thinking, so these are maybe interesting books, I like them, maybe I'm really fond of them, but I can't explain what's really going on. And I think that there are ways to understand the deeper structure and meanings and purposes of the Narnia books, which are fruitful for us if we want to kind of read them again and perhaps read them better. If you hate the Narnia books, I doubt this is going to convince you as to their value, but it might make them a curiosity to you. But if you like them, or if you haven't read them, or if you're interested in them, I think you'll probably find this interesting. So basically, the key book informing what I'm going to say, my pile of books is falling down, what a disaster, is something called Planet Narnia by Michael Ward. The Seven Heavens in the Imagination of C.S. Lewis, which was published in 2008. I think it was completed sometime before, possibly the early noughties, as a PhD. And I think, from memory, Planet Narnia is the more or less a rewritten version of the PhD, and I think there may be a simplified version of it. There was a documentary called The Narnia Code, which you can watch. I think it might even have been on YouTube a few years ago, but certainly also there are interviews with Michael Ward. So the theory here, I give full credit to. Now, here's the interesting thing. This is a theory that it purports to explain secret structures underneath the writing of the Narnia books. And if you're familiar with Ward, you'll be familiar with where I'm going with this. And before the book came out, before people had read the manuscript or whatever else, I think scholars were interested in it and were like, that'll be interesting to read a bold contribution in an academic field. And in academia, people don't all agree about stuff. You have compelling theories, but there is always heavy dissidence. There's lots of different theories. And what happened was that people said, it sounds interesting from what I've heard him say at a conference, but I think he's going to have to have a big case to prove this particular theory. It's not going to happen. It came out, and virtually everyone has just accepted since then. In the last, now 14 years since the book came out, I think technically people had seen it slightly earlier, that this is just an explanation of some very important things going on in Lewis. And here's a marker of how widely accepted this theory is, that it's maybe its biggest academic or Lewisian studies critic is someone called Brenton Dickerson, he's got a website called A Pilgrim in Narnia, which I'm actually he's actually got a really useful graphic to do with what I'm about to talk about, which I'll put in the description. He's very kindly summed up some of Ward's argument for him. But basically Dickerson's point is, I don't really agree with this. I think it's really interesting. I don't really agree with it though, because I think it's slightly overstrained. But basically the basic thesis is completely right. That's the biggest criticism. And the basic thesis is that to understand the Narnia books, and to understand a lot of Lewis's work, but particularly the Narnia books, you have to understand medieval cosmology, the way that ancient and medieval people, because for Lewis it's a continuity, looked at the sky and understood the universe. And the way they understood the universe is imaginatively and physically somewhat different, significantly different to ours. And I'll read a quote from Lewis in a minute on that. But basically, Ward's argument is that the 7 Narnia books each map to a medieval planet. There were 7 planets you could see from the Earth. This was the point. There's the sun. This is a planet, not in the sense that people necessarily thought it was made of a solid, but that planet meant large celestial objects you could see. So there's the sun, the moon, and then there's Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. 7 planets that you can see from the Earth. In fact, a significant image that's useful to understand how medievals thought about the cosmos was that they were ball bearing on the bottom of this big astrolabe going round and round. They thought they're at the centre of the universe, not in the sense they're in the best position, but that they were in the least glamorous position. Nonetheless, the view was amazing. They couldn't hear the music of the spheres, but they got to watch the dance. And here is, I'll give you a teaser here, because I'm not going to be able to summarise this whole thing in the next kind of 7 or 8 minutes or something, and then offer some reading thoughts. But basically, a thing that really informed Ward, I was wondering, how do I defend Lewis's books from the charge of simplicity when they're obviously quite deeply thought through? There's lots of things going on, even in these kids' books. How do I explain and defend that? You know, what's the key to this? And he was reading the poem The Planets by C.S. Lewis, which describes Jupiter as having a quality of, I think I've got the poem here. I will get it up. Is this The Planets? Yeah. Of, let's see if I can Control F this, of winter. So talking of Jove, in Jove's orbit filled and festal, faster turning with Arcampla, from the Isles of Tyrian traders and trouble steering came with his cargoes, the Cornish treasure that his ray ripens, of wrath ended and woes mended, of winter past and guilt forgiven, and good fortune Jove is master. Jove being Jupiter. This is about the medieval planets. No doubt this is about medieval planets as a whole, this poem. And a quality of Jove, Jupiter, is that he is the master of wrath ended and woes mended, of winter past and guilt forgiven, and good fortune. And of jocund revel, laughter of ladies. And suddenly Ward had a revelation. That sounds a lot like the plot to The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Winter past and guilt forgiven, wrath ended and woes mended. And so he thought, wait, so Lewis really cared about medieval cosmology. He was an expert on the medieval mindset and medieval and Renaissance literature. Maybe this was an influence. And essentially he maps out that these 7 books, and I'll talk about some examples of how, but these 7 books are each based on a medieval planet. But there's a couple of things to understand we'll go through before we get to that, which is what Lewis thought about the medieval mindset and the cosmos and their way of writing as well. Here is a description from, this is maybe the most important book. It's not a book you'd expect to read, and it's quite an entertaining book, but it's also technically an academic book from, albeit the 40s or so, The Discarded Image by C.S. Lewis. It is available in a fairly cheap edition from Canto Classics. He says this, that the really important difference between our universe and theirs, as it were, is that the medieval universe, while unimaginably large, was also unambiguously finite. And one unexpected result of this is to make the smallness of Earth more vividly felt. In our universe, she is small, no doubt, but so are the galaxies, so is everything, and so what? But in theirs, there was an absolute standard of comparison. The furthest sphere, Dante's Maggior Corpo, is quite simply and finally the largest object in existence. The word small, as applied to Earth, thus takes on a far more absolute significance. Again, because the medieval universe is finite, it has a shape, the perfect spherical shape, containing with itself an ordered variety. Hence, to look out on the night sky with modern eyes is like looking out over a sea that fades away into mist, or looking about one into a trackless forest. Trees forever, no horizon. To look up at the towering medieval universe is much more like looking at a great building. The space of modern astronomy may arouse terror, or bewilderment, or vague reverie. The spheres of the old present us with an object in which the mind can rest, overwhelming in its greatness, but satisfying in its harmony. That is the sense in which our universe is romantic, and theirs was classical. This explains why all sense of the pathless, the baffling, and the utterly alien, think Lovecraft, all agoraphobia is so markedly absent from medieval poetry when it leads us, as so often, into the sky. As he says, Dante, whose theme might have been expected to invite it, never strikes that note. The meanest modern writer of science fiction can, in that department, do more for you than he. Isn't that an interesting statement? And isn't that a paean, a song to this ordered universe in the sky, that you look at the sky and you see order, not chaos, a purpose, not purposelessness, It's a theme that lots of writers have grappled with, isn't it? It's a massive change in the mind, not rendered necessarily by the Copernican Galilean revolutions, but by really by a different imaginative shift. And Lewis writes the discarded image to say, look, we don't understand what these old people thought. We are so different, we don't even understand. We read their things and we are baffled because they have a different imagination of the entire universe to us. They are essentially, in that sense, as different to us in many ways as ancient Indians or ancient Chinese or ancient Japanese or ancient Ghanaians or ancient Americans, you know. So this is what he's saying, is that this is Ward's thesis, that is, that vision of the world really informs Lewis's works. And this is where, by the way, the disagreement Brenton Dickinson has, is he says, yes, actually, I can see all of Lewis's works, including definitely the Narniad, I agree, you've proven that, is really influenced by the medieval cosmology. He just doesn't think it maps to each planet very well, comparatively. Everyone else does, but just to give him his due. The second thing you need to know about is a different Lewis technical book. This is it's technically an Oxford Galaxy. What was that? Oxford University Press via New York. So this was the American imprint, a Galaxy book. It would have come out via UP originally. The Allegory of Love by C.S. Lewis. It's a study in medieval tradition and of both the sentiment called courtly love and of the allegorical method from 11th century Languedoc to 16th century England. C.S. Lewis devotes considerable attention to the Romance of the Rose and the Fairy Queen and to such poets as Chaucer, Gower and Thomas Usk. So, allegory. What do you think allegory is? Well, you do probably think, if you've read Narnia, that Narnia is an allegory. That won't disturb you. I actually am more so academically engaged in studying allegory, but a much earlier period, a classical ancient allegory. But allegory in the medieval world does not mean, so someone says, I'm going to write a story, and in the story, the tree represents evil, but the dog is a figure of kindness and good. And each one of these elements can be easily abstracted to create a message. And that's maybe how we read Narnia. We think, and that's one reason why people trying to find theological parallels find Narnia so difficult, not so easy. Aslan's Christ, the sacrifice at the stone table, is kind of like the crucifixion. But even there is not a one-to-one parallel. And you look at other stuff and it's completely bemusing. What on earth is he talking about? But the Renaissance allegory, for instance, like the Fairy Queen by Spencer, is not a one-to-one kind of allegory where you decode it with a kind of a code book that says this means this. There will be elements like that in lots of those ancient and medieval works, but on the whole, I've literally just turned, by the way, to this is Book 2 of the Fairy Queen, Canto 12, verse 51. This is complete coincidence. There too the heavens, always jovial, capitalised, jovial, looked on them lovely, still in steadfast state, nor suffered storm nor frost on them to fall, their tender buds or leaves to violate, nor scorching heat nor cold intemperate to afflict the creatures which therein did dwell. But the mild air with season moderate, gently attempered, and disposed so well, that still it breathed forth sweet spirit and wholesome smell. You can turn to a random page in the Fairy Queen and find out that the heavens looked down with a jovial cast, giving lovely weather to these lovers, I take it. The point proven, their world was different. The way they understood the world was different. But the way they often wrote, and you see this with Chaucer, you see this, who translated the Romance of the Rose, the Romaunt of the Rose. You see it with the French poets. You see it with Tasso and Ariosto. You will see it, therefore, to some degree, just incidentally, not via the same streams of French influence, but with Dante, that when he is writing the Divine Comedy, it is not that the whole thing is meant to be a one-to-one representation of things that are actually happening in hell or purgatory or heaven. By the way, remember, for Dante, the Inferno is not the most important thing. He could not conceive. We might find the Paradiso boring. Again, the worldview is so different. He could not conceive that that was boring. That would be for him the most exciting part. But yeah, the fact that these were not meant to be one-to-one representations of things that actually happened, and these were meant to be ways of talking about the world and talking about these real places to Dante, maybe not to us, but to Dante, but in a poetic way that wasn't easily abstracted, but which let us draw wider messages and to be invaded by that world, to live in the world of the story. A very modern concept, really. Certainly you find that so with something like the Inferno, which is, everyone loves the Inferno, every great books course has it and so on. And with the Inferno, you're not talking about, oh well, this is a really easy thing where you just find out things about hell from. It's that you're absorbed into this nightmarish depiction of wickedness and of Dante and Virgil going around and seeing the various forms of human wickedness. But anyway, those are two key elements to understand about Lewis's professional life. And we see in this poem, The Planets, it begins to come through that he begins to want to talk about the way in which the planets operate, and to and he talks about the discarded image. He ends by saying, of course, we do not physically believe in these things, but there may be a way in which this should influence our minds poetically, imaginatively, should give us a way of thinking about the world. Then the final piece in this puzzle to understand is, it's the whole science fiction trilogy by Lewis, but particularly That Hideous Strength, which is the third and final novel and one of my top 5 sci-fi novels. And here's a clue: it's a Renaissance, an early Renaissance or late Middle British book by Sir David Lindsay. The name comes from that. The shadow of that hideous strength sacks mile and more it is of length. That is to say, the Tower of Babel, which definitely connects into some stuff going on in this. In this book, there's Arthurian stuff, there's Merlin, there's new Arthurs, there's demons, but they're aliens, or are they something? And there is a descent of the gods, the descent of the planets down to Earth. And there's earthly aspects of those planets as well as the celestial aspects who descend at one point. It is an insane and incredible novel. It's not necessarily his tightest novel. The Narnia books actually are formally probably better, but it's probably his best novel. And one of the great novels, just for sheer imaginative, rhetorical and moral power. The magnificent book. But in that, the fact that he has already begun to playfully and increasingly seriously integrate the ways that the worlds, the planets work in the solar system. And this is the medieval planets, because he goes to, Ransom, the main character, goes to Mars, then to Venus. Venus is a new creation, in that context, with a new Adam and a new Eve, and then the planets descend to Earth in this major battle, and those planets are they're the good guys, these archangels, basically. Like, if you want to think about it, it's a bit the what are they called? The Malakil, the kind of the planetary spirits are archangels. They are the Valar in Tolkienian terms, if you want to think in those terms, but they're the archangels, and they're also generating angels. Our planet, the silent planet, has a bad archangel, or bad planetary spirit, Oyarezu. I can't remember all the words, and then many other spirits, of course. And importantly, our world is bounded by the lunar orbit, because and the moon is half scarred by the war between the planetary spirits, and the dark side of the moon is fertile, because the bound of the Earth in medieval cosmology is the moon. And so you've got this thing where Lewis is starting to work out in fiction an explicit representation of the planets. Then he writes one other major novel, one proper work that he finishes after the Planetary Trilogy, which is Till We Have Faces, which is an excellent book. But he then writes the Narniad, and people often see this. There are things which I won't go into in detail, but where people say, oh, so he gave up. There's a myth, and it is an actual myth. Simply not true, that he debated Elizabeth Anscombe over some point of Christian apologetics and lost, and so he stopped writing that and thought he'd write kids stories instead. And essentially this is the Philip Pullman version of it, to trick the kids, which of course, wonderfully for Philip Pullman, inspired Pullman to write books that tried to do the same. The point is that didn't happen, but he did come to want to write ideas down in fiction that he felt were only partly communicated through his non-fiction works. He continued writing spiritual non-fiction till the end of his life. But yeah, he starts to write these and he'd written fiction, spiritual fiction before that in the Planets trilogy. But he starts to write the Narniad, and these 7 books, lovely books, starting with The Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe, ending with The Last Battle, Very popular, lots of wonderfully memorable things in them. But confusing things like, as I say, here, good examples. Why is Father Christmas in Lion Witch Wardrobe? Except, I suppose, because he wanted to come up with some way to show winter was moving, and that's about the winter solstice or something. The silver chair, what's that about? And of course there's the minor controversies, about is this bad or is this good? How is he presenting this character? But I'm talking about the kind of structural stuff. How does it hang together as a series? Why are there these different kinds of stories that don't completely make sense next to each other, based on just thinking about them as simple Christian allegories for children? And here is Ward's realization, as I say, that these are based on the medieval planets. So his argument goes. And there are hints in some of Lewis's letters that something like this is going on, but he doesn't ever say it during his life. But then precisely what he's argued about medieval and Renaissance and ancient allegory is that often it's not there for you to try to pick apart, but for you to absorb and experience and for it to emerge upon you, and for you to be influenced by this whole world in this not one-to-one but this detailed way. And yes, he then says, so each of these planets sums up particular things. So you've got Jupiter, Jove, who is the... and I'm not going to be able to give detailed examples of this, of course, but this is Lion Witch Wardrobe. And it is a book of guilt past and winter past, guilt forgiven, etc. What happens is they go to a place where there is a false queen. It's the royal book, remember, the false queen who makes everything winter. Then the rightful under kings turn up, and so the true king, the rightful king, Aslan, arrives, and winter begins to pass. Winter begins to pass, and they meet Father Christmas himself, a jovial, red-cheeked figure who gives them gifts, a royal act. And then they go and meet Aslan, but then there's this problem with Edmund, and Edmund has betrayed Aslan and the other children. Well, rather, he's betrayed the other children. But also, the key thing is that he has been captured. The other children can't really be hurt by the White Witch because Aslan's there. But Edmund's been captured, and so to redeem him, Aslan dies. And that is a very obvious allegorical point. Except here, Lewis was clear about this. That is not meant to be a one-to-one analogy for Christ. It's meant to be an imaginative exercise where this world is what would happen if God created a different world with different conditions applying. In that one, he only dies for the one. He doesn't die for all in the same way because that's not the same situation. Which is a clue, by the way, that he is not attempting to write what Tolkien thought he was doing and was very angry about, a cheap one-to-one analogy allegory. He then writes Prince Caspian. There's Mars. There are many other things, of course, which is all about kingship particularly, but other examples too. Mars. In this, it's the book about music, but it's also the book when they spend a lot of time wandering around a forest. It does not happen in other books. Why? Well, because Mars, his second aspect is to be the god of the forest. Mars Silver, the god of the forest. And so you have all these things about war. It's something where, though there is battle in other books, there is even a book called The Last Battle. The book that is most about war is Prince Caspian. It is not about kingship, even though Prince Caspian is attempting to become the king, or that is his rightful post. Very little language of that type comes up. This is Ward's argument anyway. Then there's the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which is the sun, which is characterised by gold. And in this one, you have the idea that there's many representations of gold, aren't there? There is the stuff that turns everything to gold, but therefore is essentially lethal to people. There's the stuff that drives people crazy and greedy for gold. But there is also the sun, the true sun. There's also the fact that there, a complicated thing, but there is this lizard slaying thing that Eustace becomes a dragon and has to destroy that to become, which comes up as an image in the Great Divorce as well, but has to destroy that lizard and that's a case of kind of repentance and becoming pure. So you've got that as well. Alchemy. There's you have a wizard who's into alchemy in that. All these features of the medieval planet of Sol. Then you've got silver chair, lunar. This is associated with the moon. Silver, lunacy, inconstancy. These are the features of the waxing and waning moon of the medieval cosmology. the idea of confusion and enchantment. They go underground and they are confused, enchanted. This is Aurelian is driven mad, Prince Aurelian. And this leads to Podogram's great statement of faith where, though he doesn't literally think nothing else is real, he says it's as if it were. Even if nothing else were real except this, I reject this. I reject this madness and I choose a sanity I cannot see. And here is a really, if you want, the most medieval moment almost in the whole books. That book starts more or less in Aslan's land. Well, rather, they're in a wet and watery England. They come through a portal, a wet and watery portal, to Aslan's land. It's sunny, it's kind of lovely up there, but then they look below and it becomes more and more watery and dense, which is the image of the world beneath the moon, which is our world, but the point being that's the lunar, the sublunar realm of it becoming more and more watery and dense. And they fall down that and things become more confusing. They look at ruins from above and then they can't find them when they're below. They go underground, they're enchanted. The person they're trying to rescue is mad. They begin to believe that nothing else exists. So that's lunacy. Then we have the horse and his boy, Mercury. Mercury is the god of communication and messaging and so on. Swiftness and haste, the lord of language. It is a book about talking horses and people learning languages. And about galloping around and marriage promises, which is another thing. Contract is a mercurial thing. This is one of the most pointed things. A major constellation in the planet Mercury in the medieval medieval astronomy is Castor and Pollux, the twins, the divine twins, who are a boxer and a horse rider respectively. And in The Horse and His Boy, there are twins who are respectively a horse rider and a boxer. There's some stuff which is pretty on the nose here, I think. Then we have Venus, represented by the magician's nephew, a book about creation, and a new Adam and Eve. We do see, however, that and Lewis critiques this elsewhere, the idea there might be an infernal Venus, a woman. So we have a woman who becomes mother of a whole new world, not just of any children she has, but of this whole world. But you also have a woman in Jadis who has used basically nuclear bombs. Functionally, it's actually evil magic, but nuclear bombs to desolate her planet. She has made everything barren and destroyed. And then you have the last battle, Saturn. Saturn is the god of death and the end. Last battle is death and the end. And Father Time comes and rolls up the carpet in that. And here's an interesting thing, that in the first draft of the Silver Chair, where they see Father Time sleeping, so that's a bit of a foreshadowing. In the first draft, he's called Kronos. That is to say, the Greek name for Saturn, the Lord of Time and the end. The last battle is about the end. It's about disaster, death, Father Time, sickness, old age, treachery, melancholy, darkness. So much that book happens at night. There are dozens of examples that Ward will give of this, but that's the point of these books for Ward's theory, that these books map to these 7 planets. These 7 planets map to a medieval world which is ordered and high and beautiful and meaningful, and beyond that, a way that you communicate truth about the world is through dense and layered fiction which embeds that truth, not in a way that's easily drawn out in a one-to-one way, but in a way that absorbs the reader. And as I say, we would, as modern readers, generally be like, oh yes, lots of authors do that, don't they? And so I suppose then to sum up and to finish up, that's a way that we can understand what Lewis is doing in Narnia. But what does that mean for us as readers? And here's what I'd suggest, that when we come to Lewis, if we don't like him, I suppose what we should do is we should go and be like, okay, now I know what he's trying to say, what do I think about that? Let me read these books and think, oh man, that makes me angry, I don't like that, or whatever, engage with it at that level. I didn't like these books, but maybe there's something technically interesting here, and maybe I'll agree with it, or be attracted to it, or maybe I'll disagree with it, but it's an interesting thing to see, what does this theory hold up. For those of us who like the Narnia books, or those who love it certainly, but those who like it and maybe have been confused by some of these aspects, return to the books and understand that they're a way of Lewis, I think, and the point is, even Brenton Dickerson, the critic of the planet Narnia, thinks, are a way of communicating the medieval worldview, not of politics or of I don't know, healthcare, but rather of understanding a beautiful and meaningful universe to us, and see where that comes up, see what he's trying to say about that, about the purposes of life and death, the ways we interact, the ways that things are built or destroyed, what makes things valuable and what makes things, what doesn't, damages them, is destructive to them. I think we can come to those books and find that, and then and try to see if we can, like Lewis, Lewis said one day you'll read fairy tales again at the start of Lion Witch Wardrobe, writing to his friend Owen Barfield's daughter. He says, of course, famously, if I can find there, if I can get to it, he writes a little letter at the start, doesn't he, about, my dear Lucy, I wrote this story for you, but when I began it I had not realised that girls grow quicker than books. As a result, you are already too old for fairy tales. By the time it is printed and bound, you'll be older still, but someday you'll be old enough to start reading fairy tales again. So perhaps that's the thing, let's have a second childhood as we read these books as fairy tales again, and understand that these are fairy tales not trying to give us simple one-to-one lessons, but a whole way of looking at the universe, that if it were to affect us, if it were to sink in, would really change the way we see life, in perhaps more ways than we expect. Anyway, that is me trying to sum up at some length Michael Ward's Planet Narnia theory, and talking about some of the sources for it, and trying to give you some first-hand insight into that from the Lewis texts. But then also, trying to just say, here's some ways we can enjoy these books more. I've always enjoyed these books, but certainly this makes me enjoy the books even more as I come back to them. What do you think about the theory? Do you find it convincing? Are you familiar with it? I bet lots of you are. And what do you find that you appreciate in Lewis's stories? Do you realise now that you always had been captured by this strange view of a world long dead, even if it never come consciously to mind? Or was that always something that bothered you and annoyed you, that he seemed to think about the world in such a strange way? Anyway, tell me those things in the comments, and we will talk again next time.